Let's talk now about the act versus rule distinction which consequentialists use to navigate the epistemic deficiency criticism. We all live in the absence of knowledge about what the future will hold. Consequentialists are perfectly aware of this, and to try to remedy this, they have distinguished between act-based consequentialism and rule-based consequentialism. And an act-based consequentialist is going to say, you should act in such a way that you bring about the best consequences for the greatest number of people. But a rule-based consequentialist is going to say you should act in accordance with a rule which, on balance, tends to bring about the best consequences for the greatest number of people. So although it might be the case that in this particular circumstance, telling a lie will benefit you and maybe a few others, still telling lies on balance is not a good idea. Because if all humanity told lies, it would be a bad rule. We wouldn't be able to create a society that would be consistent and that people could trust and navigate successfully. So for rule-based consequentialists, the thing to do is to always act in accordance with a rule which on balance tends to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or the best overall consequences for the collective. This is a really important distinction, so I want to make sure we've got this one. Act consequentialists say you should do the action that will bring about the best consequences. Rule consequentialists say you should do the rule which on balance tends to bring about the best consequences. Because obviously we never know in any particular circumstance, because of the epistemic deficiency problem, whether what we are doing right here, right now is going to be the best overall, lead to the best overall outcome. Rule consequentialism is a compromise with deontology. Because remember, deontology is a way of thinking about morality that says that the right thing to do is to act in accordance with principles. And although deontology says we should formulate those principles irrespective of consequences, consequentialists, when they become rule consequentialists, absorb some of that deontological way of thinking, but don't absorb the rest. They take the idea of a rule and they say that's a good way to approach ethics. We should act in accordance with rules. But they say we should formulate our rules on the basis of what tends to bring about the best consequences, not on the basis of considerations that are pre-consequential or irrespective of consequences. The reason why a deontologist would say we should act in accordance with the principle, we should follow the principle, don't take innocent human life, is because that principle is right, regardless of the consequences. Whereas the rule consequentialist would say the reason why we should follow that principle, don't take innocent human life, is because it, on balance, tends to lead to the best consequences for the collective when we don't take innocent human life. The way they formulate the rules differs, although the idea of a rule is a compromise with deontology. It's just the sourcing of the rule for consequentialists tends to be different. Let me pause and ask if there are questions or comments about the epistemic deficiency criticism. Everybody good there? Here's a fourth criticism. Ethical impartiality is counterintuitive. Ethical impartiality is counterintuitive. What do I mean by that? If your beloved parents are in a boat that has tipped over in the middle of the river, and they're drowning. You're in a boat that can rush to them and rescue them. But you see off to the other side of your boat some random strangers, two of them who also have flipped over in theirs, and they are drowning. And you have a sudden choice, and you can only rescue one party, either your parents or the two strangers. Would any of us rescue the strangers? Really? I don't think any human being whose ethics I trust would rescue the strangers. And yet, consequentialists tell us that we are to be impartial between humans, across humans, impartial as to our own good, impartial as to the good of our immediate friends and relatives, our loved ones. And we are to compare them vis-a-vis others and only favor those numbers which are the greatest, or those utiles of happiness which on balance are the strongest. We should not favor the familiar over the remote just because it is the familiar. And yet when you look at the way humans behave and what humans believe to be right, it is clear time and again that we believe it to be right to favor the familiar over the remote. Here's an example, just to press the point. I read bedtime stories to my little daughters. They love story time with Daddy. Okay, it's a time of great happiness, great joy. I get to teach them language. We read stories in German. I speak German to my children. And it's educational. It gives them a leg up in life. It forms social bonds, great relational connection. They love it. It brings them great happiness. You know what I'm not doing during bedtime stories with Daddy? I am not reading bedtime stories to the other children on my block. I am favoring my own over the other children. I am being partial to the familiar. And yet, would any of us condemn bedtime stories with Daddy as being immoral? I don't think anybody would. And yet, it is clear that what I am doing is I am giving my children a leg up in life, educationally, over and against the other children on the block who I could, during bedtime stories with Daddy, I could also potentially be reading bedtime stories to. I am favoring my own children. All parents do this. Parents who are enrolling their children in after-school programs to give their children a leg up in school, or who pay for special tutoring, or who themselves tutor their children to try to give their children a leg up in school. Are they immoral? What if instead of tutoring their, let's say, 3 children or 2 children at home, what if they had an opportunity to tutor 5 strangers during that time, but it was only a set time during the week and they couldn't do both? Again, I think the great majority of humans would say it is perfectly justifiable for them to tutor their own children. And in fact, it's better that way because that forms emotional bonds, it forms relational connections. There's nothing wrong with doing that sort of thing. In fact, it is a better overall arrangement to have family structures with tight emotional bonds and partiality like that. And yet, consequentialists tell us we ought not to be partial. Taken to its logical extreme, consequentialism seems to suggest that families are immoral. And not just families, but any kind of special relational arrangement over and against others who are not a part of that arrangement. I favor my students over others who are outside of the university when it comes to the amount of email time I can allot each day. If you send me an email and you are outside of the university, you are bottom of my totem pole. Students go, their emails go to the top, and random emails from strangers get shuffled to the bottom if I even answer them at all. And I think that way of approaching morality is something that people the world over would see as justifiable. And they would see the impartiality idea of the consequentialists as being strange and hard to wrap their minds around. Okay, so the criticism here is that ethical impartiality is counterintuitive, indeed deeply counterintuitive, and goes against some of our most beloved moral ideals. Any questions or comments about that criticism?